for that very generous introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge that we meet tonight on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge David. We actually met for the first time, or spent some time together anyway, a few years ago when David was first running for Parliament, and we had a candidates forum on the Central Coast, and we invited all the candidates, and David duly turned up, and he was the only one that turned up, and I was meant to be the kind of MC for the night, so I had to do my very best Tony Jones, and we got out some soft comfy chairs, and we had a lovely evening of Q&A with Emma and David, so we're together again. So our topic tonight is about, can we rebuild, and I'm going to concentrate on the union movement by focusing on social justice issues. And in short, my answer is yes, we can, and yes, we are, and yes, we need to do more of it, and yes, we need to do it much better. And now, if I had my druthers, I'd just get a video screen out and play you Sally McManus's speech from yesterday at the National Press Club, and I'd be done for the evening. But you know, I know you came for a live speaker tonight. But the union movement is already trying to rebuild itself, I think, focusing on social justice issues. And I think we need to give ourselves credit that we are a big player in terms of ensuring that people get a fair go in terms of the relationship between the individual and society, and that we have those systems in place to make sure that we have just and equitable outcomes. And so if you look at the campaigns that we have done in the past and that we are still campaigning on today, social justice issues really are very prominent. We've got public health care, obviously Medicare was part of an Accord win in the 80s. We've got public education is still a big focus with Gonski and all the campaigns around saving TAFE. Dignity in retirement, another Accord win, Accord Mark II. You know, even though our super system is quite flawed, I think in terms of outcomes for women, it is an area where we're continuing to focus. Equal pay for women, you know, starting in '69 and all the cases since then. Quality childcare. We're still arguing around that in terms of big steps and trying to get justice for childcare workers. Quality public services. Paid parental leave, domestic violence leave. I mean, that's been a massive one in recent years in terms of trying to get, starting out by negotiating in awards and then moving on to trying to actually improve the national employment standards to get domestic violence leave for all workers. And there's been a real challenge there in terms of trying to get employers and the community to understand that this isn't a private issue, this is a workplace issue, and this is an issue for everybody. Increases in the minimum wage that Sally talked about yesterday, and so on. So the union movement is campaigning. We are focusing on improving the social contract around delivering social justice and achieving a just and equitable society. But let's face it, we're not always winning those campaigns, and the social justice advances that we have secured over decades and decades are under threat at the moment. And the union movement is declining. We're, 17% now. And we all know that inequality is rising. So, you know, the Gini coefficient, that is one of the measures of inequality. Australia is 0.33, whereas at the good end, you've got Norway with 0.25, and right at the top, the US with 0.4. So we're right in the middle there. And when we do tend to think of ourselves as being an egalitarian society, but that statistic doesn't bear it out. The top 20% hold 60% of all the wealth, and the bottom 20% hold less than 1% of all the wealth. We used to have much more equal distribution of wealth before the 1980s, but it just isn't the case anymore. And the thing with inequality, though, which is a good thing, is that Australians actually really care about it. So there's been some recent research on this as well, and 78% of Australians agree that inequality affects us all because it creates social and economic division. What a great statistic that is. And also large majorities, that is, in the 60s, agree that Australian society has become more unequal recently, that to reduce inequality, the minimum wage should be increased significantly, and that unions have a role to play in reducing inequality. So all great facts. So for me, the conclusion is that the union movement needs to campaign around inequality. And I know a number of unions, including the ACTU, are really trying to formulate what that looks like. And it is a very broad topic, but I think that's actually a bonus for us because we can target any number of its manifestations with different campaigns. We can look at having fairer tax systems, better wages, public education, public health, targeting poverty, all those different elements with different campaigns. But the thing that I want to really focus on tonight is that we need to get that campaigning right. It's great to know what we need to do, but we need to actually have the execution done well. And that means for the union movement, really excellent strategic campaigning. And I wanted to go through an example that I really like that I don't think gets a lot of currency. It is an overseas example, and I know sometimes people get frustrated when we talk about stuff that happens in the US. I think the reason why we tend to go to those examples is that the American labour movement, despite being smaller, still has a lot bigger budgets than we have here, and so some of these experiments they can run on a much bigger scale than we can here in Australia. So this one example is actually from a book by Jane McAlavey, who Unions New South Wales brought out last year. Her first book was called Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, and it's a great read. And it talks about a number of things, and one of the organising campaigns she talks about was the Stamford Geographic Organising Project, and it was in the early 2000s, so it's not too long ago. And the AFL-CIO put resources into multi-union, multi-sector organising in a whole lot of geographic areas, and the one that Jane worked on was in Stamford, Connecticut. And I'll give you the punchline first, so to whet your appetite. So the outcomes they got were 4,500 workers joined unions and won first contracts. Obviously they have a different system in the US. But to put that in perspective, that's 10% of the working population of Stamford. That's huge. They saved 4 public housing projects from being demolished, and they won $15 million in improvements to those public housing projects. They won one-to-one replacement guarantees for some public housing that was going to be demolished, as well as some commitments around affordable housing zoning. And they shifted the political power in the city and had a number of different representatives elected in school boards and other government roles. So how did they do it? And there's 3 key critical elements to the campaign. And one is the one that Jane really talks about a lot and we don't do enough of, which is a power structure analysis. So what involves, I won't get too technical, but the first step is, you get some professional research into the power structure in the community, but the second step is that you actually pool the knowledge of all the members, all the workers, in terms of what they know, who's influential. You pool all that knowledge and you actually get the organisers and the members themselves, the workplace leaders, to carry out that research. And what that showed in the Stamford Organising Project was that there was an acute housing crisis, rings a bit of a bell here, and there was also simmering racial tensions, and those were the 2 dominant issues. So it wasn't wages so much. And there was a lot of debate in the union after that power structure analysis, after it showed that housing was that key issue. And people were kind of asking, well, if we campaign around housing, is that just like some kind of idealistic pipe dream? Are we just going to be flushing a lot of union money down the toilet? Will it actually organise the workers? And obviously, the punchline, it did 10%. But the power structure analysis made the union understand that no matter how much the union could win for the workers in terms of wage improvements, they were still going to be in poverty if they couldn't fix the housing issue. And it also made them realise that representing the interests of workers doesn't mean that they had to rethink the role of unions in terms of the role unions could play in terms of those so-called community issues that sometimes we tend to put off to one side and not bring into the mainstream work of the union movement. So this really is the second critical part of the campaign, which is that strategic mindset that considers the challenges that are being faced by workers as a whole, not just the challenges that are being faced by those workers at work. So they didn't have this false dichotomy between work issues and problems that are elsewhere. They did this kind of whole worker organising, is how Jane talks about it. And the third critical element is leadership development, and I think we don't do enough of this in the union movement. We don't do it well. We tend to go to the loudest mouth rather than the true leaders, and it takes more time to identify the true leaders and develop them, but it's well worth it. And it's also important and this was part of the Stanford project, was empowering workers to be the central participants in their campaigns. So even just that first step of doing the power structure analysis by pooling what the workers knew was part of beginning to empower those workers to realise that all this knowledge that they actually had, that they weren't even appreciating the strategic importance of it and how they could leverage and build on that power and that knowledge to win. And they had some great tactics, of course. We love tactics in the union movement. They reached out to those power bases, a lot of church organising, but the unions at that point weren't in the churches that were actually the most powerful, was what they discovered. So they had to make these new alliances with these other church leaders. They door-knocked whole housing estates, just over a summer, like months, day after day after day. And they had, of course, frequent public shows of strength, which are always good tests for how your organising is going, marches and turning out to public meetings and that kind of thing. And you can read the book to get the full story. But the lesson really is, I think, from this, and what I really wanted to say tonight about how to rebuild the union movement around social justice issues, is getting the right issue really, really matters. And that isn't necessarily a wage issue or a workplace issue. It's an issue that matters to that person and is impactful on their life. That you need to find that right issue, and that and I think inequality in all its manifestations may well be the right issue for the union movement right now. We probably need to do some more work on it, but that seems to be the direction. But the secondary element is getting the campaign right, doing it properly and well, and that's just a huge amount of hard work on the ground, building those workplace leaders, making those connections, building the power. But the Stanford project showed that if you get the issue right and if you get the campaign right, you can win and you can rebuild the union movement and you can build a more just and equal society. So that's it from me. I didn't need the bell.